This video is brought to you by Battle Axe. I am ridiculously excited for this video to be posted because that means that Rubberhose 3 is here.
Rubberhose 3. Rubberhose 3.
Rubberhose 3.
There's so many new features in Rubberhose 3, it's been rewritten from the ground up. I'm so excited to finally be able to share it all with you, and I know Adam's excited. I mean, look how excited Adam is. I'm gonna cover as many of these new features as I possibly can in this video and put chapter markers down at the bottom so that you can jump around if you wanna see a specific feature of Rubberhose 3, but I've also put together an entire playlist of user guide videos that go along with the Battle Axe website user guide. So if you wanna learn absolutely every single thing about all of the new features of Rubberhose 3, how every single button works, you can go check that out. This video though is more for those of you who are already familiar with the Rubberhose system, maybe you're already using Rubberhose 2. I'm gonna get you up to speed with the new system and how to start rigging characters. I've also made a bunch of character artwork that you can download. Just follow the link in the description and you can check all this out yourself. But enough talking, let's get you up to speed with what's new in Rubberhose 3. Well, first things first, Rubberhose 3 is now an extension instead of a script, which means that it's a much nicer design, better layout, much more responsive, and more advanced. So as I'm moving things around, you can see that the buttons are rearranging. It's very flexible and fits in whatever workspace you want to work in very smoothly. But there are some similarities to version 2, the build, style, and manage sections. Similar functions to version 2 live in each one of these sections, so that should be very familiar. Let's start with the build section and just creating a rubber hose. When I click on this, it's going to ask me for a name for the hose as well as labels for the start and end controllers. I'll leave everything at its default and click OK. That'll generate 3 layers, 2 controllers and the actual hose. It's very responsive, very familiar to what we used to have. This is your standard hose. Now on the end controller is where the basic parameters of the hose are going to live underneath these 2 effects, Rubberhose 3 and Rubberhose Bend. Again, a lot of this is familiar. We've got hose length controls, we've got the realism, which helps soften bend popping when going from a straightened hose to a bent hose. We've got roundness to change how round the hose actually is, as well as the direction so we can change which side this should be bending towards. But there's a new property in version 3 called slide, and this allows you to change the position of the bend based on a percentage of the length of the hose. So by default, it's going to be at halfway, 50%, but you can move that bend to anywhere you want and it's going to update. It's really, really nice to be able to adjust that, but here's what's even cooler. With version 3, you can have multiple bends on any hose, and it's as easy as duplicating this Rubberhose bend effect and then changing the slide. Just like that, I now have 2 bends on my hose, and it can be a little bit more precise. Maybe I'll put these at 25 and 75%, and now I've got a very unique looking hose. But each one of these bends has its own independent unique controls for each bend. So I could change the direction of the second bend and kind of get this zigzag shape hose, and I could modify the direction so it's not as extreme in either direction, and now I have something that resembles a little bit more like an animal's leg where it has multiple bends. And the slide, roundness, and direction apply to those bends specifically. So I could make one of them round, maybe I push it a little bit further up, and maybe dial back the direction a little bit, but we can make some very unique looking bends with this new bend system. And you can just as easily remove bends. Just select whichever bend you want to get rid of and press delete, and that will remove the bend. And we can modify the single bend again, or if you want to get rid of all of the bends, you could just delete the other one as well, and now you'd basically just have a line rig controlled by 2 Rubberhose controllers. So that's a little fun fact. But let's get back to where we have 1 bend, and let's say I want to have 2 bends along this hose but placed a little bit more precisely. Well, I can go into the manage section and find the add bend button, and when I click on that, it's going to evenly distribute both of those bends along the hose between the start and the end. I can do this as many times as I want, and it's going to keep adding more and more bends. I could also hold shift and click again, and that's going to split the difference between the last bend in the list and the end controller. So if I do that again, add bend, it's going to put the bend halfway between the last bend that was there already and the end of the controller. So that's a really quick and easy way to add bends at precise places along the hose much more quickly. But what's so powerful about this bend system is that it allows you to add very complex bends to a hose, creating limbs for maybe characters that you couldn't before with Rubberhose 2. Like this rig right here. This is my dog Pixel that I've done in kind of a cartoony style, and I've created a bend system for each one of these legs that more realistically simulates a dog's anatomy, where it bends first up here and then travels down the leg, it bends again in the opposite direction, and then we've got a paw at the end. So using multiple bends, changing their directions and roundness, you can create much more complex looking hoses than you could previously. Another new feature is the Style Manager for Rubberhose 3, which ships with a bunch of different presets, but you'll notice there are two different icons preceding all of these presets. One is this circle with the dot inside. That is a style preset. So with any layer from a hose selected, I could say double click on one of these and it's going to apply a style preset. My hose shape didn't change, but the size of the stroke, we've got an outline around it. The style, the appearance of that hose has changed. And you'll notice this one is really cool. It gives you that bend crease at the joint there. So this could be great for a leg or an arm where you want that crease shape to happen when the hose actually bends. And what's really cool is that these presets not only save the styling of that layer, but also any custom controls that have been added to it. So you can see that we've added a pseudo effect with custom controls for the colors, the thickness of the outline, the base width of the hose, all kinds of settings that are unique to this particular style, and that can transfer to a style preset. So expressions, effects, pseudo effects, layer styles, all of those things can be saved with a style preset. And you really should take a look at all of these because there are some really, really great features of each one of them that actually make designing a character right here in After Effects really easy. And a lot of them have completely custom controls directly on the hose layer. So make sure that you go through all of these and take a look at what these special controls actually do. Now, there's one down here called Taper Multicolor. This is one of my favorites because it gives us this tapering rig, but it also allows us to choose multiple colors along that taper and where they're placed. So it's very easy to control. I could bring up this first color to make this more like a short sleeve shirt or short pants instead of long. And I have independent width controls for all of these colors. So if I turn the second color down a little bit and I bring the other two down as well, that way they're not showing behind this color right here. But you'll notice these are all percentages because this is all based off of the base width of the entire hose. So I could just take the stroke width right here and make it bigger or smaller, and everything's going to be relative to that width. So lots of really cool things that you can do with these presets, but just like with version 2, you can dig into here, go into the contents, into the style, and modify these to your heart's content, creating your own style. So let me just go back to the basic hose style and check out how that content looks very similar to what we had before. We've got a path up at the top and then a stroke applied. So you could duplicate this stroke and make it a different size if you want to have layered strokes, or you could duplicate this entire group and change it around so that you can make trimmed versions of the same path. It's completely customizable. And like I said, you can tie it to expressions, add any kind of custom rigging that you want to the actual style, and then we can save those presets right here with the Save Preset button. So why don't I show you that really quickly? I'll just take this basic hose and I'll duplicate it, and I'll rename this Trimmed Hose, and let's just change the size of that to be a little bit bigger, and we'll change the color to maybe be a denimish color, and I'll add a trim paths to that shape group, and we'll trim this back to be somewhere around here. We could go a lot more complicated with this, but just for the sake of time, let's say that's the style that I want it to be. Now I can save this preset just by clicking the Save Preset button. This is gonna open up the directory that all of the presets that ship with Rubberhose 3 live. So I could save this right in here. I'll call this Trimmed Hose and just click Save. And we're gonna get a warning, but you can dismiss that. And what's really cool is that it's automatically going to refresh and show up right here. There's my Trimmed Hose preset. So if I made a new hose, let's just delete this one. I'll make another new hose, click OK, and then double clicked on Trim Hose. There's my style applied. But here's where it gets really cool. Obviously, there are lots of presets that come with Rubberhose 3, and if you start adding your own, this list could get pretty long. So what you could do is right click in here, say Open Styles Folder. Again, ignore this warning, just click Yes, and that will open up the directory, either in File Explorer or Finder, that those presets live in. Now, Rubberhose 3, this is where all of those presets are. I'm just gonna cut my Trimmed Hose style preset out of this folder, and I'm gonna make a new folder in this directory. So new directory, and I'll call this one Jake. Go into that folder and paste it in there. Now, if I close out of here and right click and say Reload Styles, immediately there's a separate folder named Jake with my Trimmed Hose preset in it. So this is going to reflect whatever your local directory has, and it's gonna make organizing presets so much simpler. And you can even have nested folders. So if I made another folder inside of Jake, in my file explorer, it's going to be reflected here, which is a huge deal for organization of all these presets. And if you were paying attention, those files that it's saving are actually .ffx files. Those are After Effects presets, which means that you can share these presets, any custom presets that you make, with anyone very easily, and it all updates really quickly right here inside of the Style Manager. Now, I said there were two different types of presets. The other one is this triangle here. These are bend presets, and they allow you to save these bend effects in whatever configuration you'd like. So let's scroll down to dog leg, and again, I'll just double click on it with the hose selected. That's going to add multiple bends, and in some cases, other effects with expressions applied to make some extra features a little bit more accessible. So this puppy leg bend preset is meant to kind of mimic, again, the way that a dog's leg would bend, but the style itself has not been changed. So I could go in here into maybe a different one called Fancy Pants. I'll double click on that one. The style's gonna update, but we still get this puppy leg bend system, which maybe doesn't work so well since this one isn't really supposed to be a dog. So I could change it to another one, maybe this S curve, and this is gonna be kind of a rounded version of that puppy leg where it bends in two different directions, but we also have this direction control to kind of flip the direction of each of these symmetrically at the same time. So there's just lots of really cool little features in each one of these presets that Adam poured a lot of time and love into to create and ship with Rubberhose 3. So make sure you play around with all of these. And just like the style presets, you can save your own custom bend presets. Just hold down the Shift key when you click on Save Preset, and that'll save just the bend data for that particular hose. Now to get back to where we were, you can always go back to the basic hose preset and the basic bend preset, and we're back to normal. But that is an incredible new feature of Rubberhose 3, so definitely take advantage of it. I think the most exciting part of this new bend system for me is just the possibilities that it opens up for being able to rig so many different types of characters than just an arm or a leg, basically with a single bend at the midpoint. And with the bend presets, you can really go nuts, like this wavy gravy preset down here at the bottom that Adam created. It's basically a sine wave for the hose between the start and end controls. You can push this and really customize the way that it works based on these parameters. So I can make this happen twice as fast by changing the speed up to 100. I could increase the amplitude to make it a bigger sine wave. I could even trim the path. So if I go into the hose style and we'll go into the basic hose group, I'll add a trim paths and we'll trim off the end value a little bit, and now it's just going to show up on that part. And maybe this works as kind of like a tail flapping around as your character is running, and it still maintains that control using the start and end controllers for the rubber hose. You could go into the stroke and start playing around with the taper, maybe turn the end length up and change the end width to be a little bit larger so that it has this nice taper. There's so many different possibilities with just the styles that ship with Rubberhose 3, but you can push this, like I said, as far as you want and create your own custom presets to make some really interesting and complex hose rigs. Another huge new feature of Rubberhose 3 is the ability to parent any layer to any point along a hose, and we're calling this parent to hose. So I've started rigging out this character over here. I have two hoses for his arms, but I have all this artwork that I'd like to attach to the arm itself along the hose, and that's exactly what parent to hose is for. So I'm gonna start with a hand, and I wanna just click on the parent to hose button, and Rubberhose will ask me which hose do I actually wanna parent this to. So this is my character's left arm, so the first one on the list, I'll click connect, and it immediately moves over to the end of the hose, and if I move the controller around, you'll see it is in fact parented to that layer. Now, I want to point out a few things. First of all, it's not exactly where I want it to be, and I can fix that really easily, but what I want to draw your attention to is the actual hand layer artwork and the parent column. Notice that there is no parent for this layer. So we're calling it parent to hose, but it's not using After Effects' native parenting system. Instead, it's using expressions on the position. Let me bring up the position, the rotation, and the anchor point to dynamically place it where it needs to be attached to the hose. So as I move my end controller around, the hand's gonna move with it. But we still have that issue of it not being aligned properly. Well, even though there are expressions driving the anchor point, you can still modify this value and it will update. So I can't click and drag this layer around. The expressions that we need for the position are necessary and will not allow you to move the layer around. But like I said, we can adjust the anchor point, which is effectively shifting the contents of that layer around. So I'm just gonna move this down down a little bit until it's about where I want it to be. And now that's going to be right at the end of my layer. And now I can even rotate the controller, and the hand layer is also going to rotate with it. Now, this whole parent to hose system has its own unique set of controls. So if I go to the effect controls, you'll see that there's a percent and a slider. This is defaulted to 100%, meaning 100% of the hose's length. So just like the bends have a percentage value for that slide, where the bend is along the hose, a parented to hose layer is going to have a percentage slider that determines where along that hose it should be parented to. This obviously could be animated if you wanted it to, but just for placement, you can slide this around to any percentage value. You'll also notice that as I move this around, it's orienting itself to the hose. Even if I were to do something like change the roundness value, if I made this a round hose, the rotation is going to update, and so is the positioning of that layer. So this is responsive to whatever shape your hose actually is, which is extremely useful for attaching things like jewelry, accessories like watches, other parts of the actual character artwork, and keeping it exactly where you want it to be. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that at the end of the layer, either end actually, it's going to automatically rotate with the controller. I have the start controller hidden here, but it is right there. But as I rotate this controller, the end layer is going to rotate with it. As soon as I move it away from that end point, it's going to orient itself to the layer, but you can rotate the layer to whatever custom orientation you want. So let's go ahead and just attach all of these layers. I'll put this all the way to the end, and let's take the roundness off of that hose and just place this where we want it, right on the hip, and I'll rotate the hand around and just have this kind of casual pose for this character. Let's move on to the watch. I'm gonna select that layer, click parent to hose. Again, the left arm is the one that I want, so I'll click OK, and then I'll just slide this up the hose. It's going to automatically orient itself to that hose shape. And then I could just use After Effects matting system to mat this to the left arm layer, turn that layer back on, and there we go. Now we don't see anything that goes beyond the width of the arm. I'll do the same thing for the cuff. I'll again click parent to hose, connect, and then slide this up to be just above the watch. And maybe I want to slide the watch down the hose just a little bit more. And then we'll grab this elbow patch and I'll parent that to the hose, click connect. And this one, I wanna be right at that 50% mark. And this is going to be an interesting issue with hoses when there's no roundness applied. As soon as I get around that 50% mark, we're gonna kind of snap the orientation, and this can cause issues. If I just put it straight at 50% and then move this around, you see that it can snap the rotation a little bit. There are two ways around this. The first one is to just check on the snap to bend checkbox, and this is going to align to the closest bend that it lives next to. So I can manually rotate that to be the orientation I want, and that's going to eliminate that popping. And this will work for any number of bends. So if I change the slide of this one a bit, it's gonna travel with it, but I could duplicate this and move it closer to the 50% mark, and you see that now it's attached to that second one, because that snapping is based on whichever percentage it's closest to. It's not gonna go anywhere else except the bend points or the start and the end. Now, I don't need multiple bends, so let me just undo and get back to where we were and show you the other way of working around this. So I'll turn snap to bend off, and I'll reorient this again back to the same direction that I wanted it to be. And what I can do is just add the slightest bit of roundness to the layer. So if I even just said 0.1, you're not really gonna see that roundness in the hose shape, but it's going to help eliminate that rotation snapping that we were getting on that elbow patch. So as I move this up and down, you can see that it's now sticking to that orientation that I want it to be in, which is exactly what I needed. Now what I can do is go into the anchor point and just shift this over to the edge, and again use After Effects matting system to just mat this to the left arm. And I need to modify this. Since my character is black and white, I can use the luminosity of the layer, a luma matte instead of an alpha matte, and that way I'm preserving my outline, and this is looking really great. Now, let's say that I wanted to basically the same thing on the opposite side, but I don't want to have to do all that complex parenting over and over again. Well, fortunately, I can duplicate this hose, and anything that's parented to it will carry over with it. So let me actually get rid of my right arm. I'll grab all of the controllers that belong to that layer. In fact, I'm just going to use the Select Group button with any one of the layers selected. Click Select Group, and that's going to select all the layers that belong to that hose, and just delete that. And then with one of the layers selected on the other hose, I'll click the Duplicate button, and I'll call this one Right Arm. and click OK, and Rubberhose is going to duplicate that hose along with all of the items that are parented to it. Here are all of the layers. I'm just gonna drag it right up to the top so I can see them because some of the layers need to be renamed. So right arm is now the name of the hose, but the other layers parented to the hose, they did not get renamed, they just got incremented. So we're gonna just rename these real quick so that it has right instead of left on each one of these. And I'm not gonna need that watch, so I can delete that. We'll rename this one right elbow patch. And then I can place these in the layer stack where I want them. So I'm just gonna move them down below the left arm and enable the right arm shoulder controller so I can see it. Grab the right arm wrist as well, and then just click and drag these over while holding Shift until it lines up about where it needs to be. And I can change the direction by going to the end controller, change that direction to -100 instead of 100, and just place this where I want it to be. And the hand is backwards, so I'm gonna need to flip this. To do that, I'm gonna bring up the scale, unlink the X and Y, and just put a negative before the X. That flips it around. We'll do the same thing for the right cuff. That's actually already flipped, so we'll flip that back. And then the elbow patch is missing, and that's just because of the matte layer that we have selected. So I'm gonna switch this from the left arm to the right arm, turn the right arm back on, and then just flip this around 180 degrees. And now we're aligned. I've duplicated my limb and have 2 working arms now. Now I just noticed that on the tip of the elbow and even some of the hose itself, there's some weird distortion going on, so I'm gonna bump up my roundness from 0.1 to 0.5, and there we go, that fixed that issue. So let's just put it back up to 0.5. Again, I really can't see the roundness in the hose, but it's allowing those elbow patches to stay oriented the way that I want them to. Now I already showed you auto rotation on the end for the hand here. That's great for hands because generally the hand is going to rotate with the forearm. That's what you would want to happen, but we can disable this for something that it doesn't make that much sense on, say like a foot down here, which I've already rigged up with parent to hose. And you'll notice that as I lift up the leg, the foot is not rotating with it, and that is because I unchecked auto rotate, which makes sense because if I were to do this with auto rotation on, then as the leg is moving, the foot's never really gonna be flat on the ground, which is not what I would want. It'd be hard to kind of counter that rotation when it should be flat on the ground. So in the case of a foot, I'm probably gonna always turn off auto rotate and then just manually rotate the foot by rotating the controller. It still follows the rotation, it's just not going to automatically rotate with the orientation of the part of the limb it's attached to. And the last thing I want to point out is that if you stretch the limb, you'll notice that nothing attached to that limb with parent to hose is going to stretch with it. So this is a perfect way to prevent distortion on things like watches or items that you don't want to stretch. If you want things to distort and stretch with the limb, then you're going to want to use RubberRig, which we're going to take a look at in just a little bit. But with the parent to hose feature, those layers will not stretch. Hopefully you can see just how much potential this feature has, allowing you to take your designs so much further past depending on a single shape layer and the hose styling to create character art. You can now literally attach anything you want and have completely custom artwork. You could even just use the hose underneath as a structure or a framework to attach all of your character artwork to. All right, let's take a step back and talk about another way to create a hose. Path to hose allows you to generate a hose based on a path that you draw or something that was already in your comp. So I want to trace this Illustrator art. This arm right here is not a shape layer. So I'm just going to grab my pen tool, click, drag right here in the middle to add a second point right at the bend where the elbow would be, and then click again at the end. This is important to have these extra points and not just 2, because path to hose is going to place bends at any point between the start and end points. So with that done, I'll just turn this down a little bit to match the width of the arm and line this a little bit more closely. Grab the color picker and change the color to match, and then I'm gonna use butt capper down here to round off the caps, and then I'll click the path to hose button and give it a name. So this is the character's right arm. I'm gonna change it to shoulder wrist and click OK. And it's going to generate a hose based on that shape layer that I just drew. Why don't I go ahead and turn off the original arm layer that was there so we can see it a little bit more closely. It's a functioning hose in that same pose that we drew, most closely representing the actual arc that I drew with the path. It's not gonna be perfect 100% of the time, but I can go in here now and just modify this so that the bend is right at 50%. And if I turn the right arm artwork back on, you can see that it's further out here. And this is really just because of the realism value. So to counteract that, I'm just going to increase the hose length a little bit, and that should do just fine. Now I'll just grab that right arm layer, drag it down here. It added a 1 because that's the same name as what the artwork was called. I'm just gonna go to my manage and say rename, and I'll give this a different name. We'll say R arm instead of right arm and click OK. That'll update all of the naming. And from here, I can very quickly just grab the hand, parent that to hose, choose right arm and click connect. And now that's attached. I'll just adjust the anchor point so it's a little bit further down. And now I have a rigged arm ready to go. Another way to use Path to Hose is with just converting your artwork to shape layers. With this Illustrator layer selected for the right leg, I'll right click, go to create and say create shapes from vector layer. And here's the path that I drew in Illustrator, but you'll notice it's just those 2 points. So if I were to use Path to Hose, it's not gonna have any bends applied. So what I wanna do is just with my pen tool, click right in the middle to add that point. And I'm also gonna add handles to that vertex by Alt or Option clicking on it, just so that roundness is also implemented when it goes to recreate this hose. I'll click Path to Hose, call this R leg. We'll change the labels to hip, ankle, click OK. Rubberhose 3 will recreate that limb as a hose. It automatically hid the original layer and I have a hose ready to go. Again, I can grab this boot, I can parent that to the hose, we'll choose the right leg, connect, and then I will disable auto rotation, adjust the anchor point to be a little bit further down, and now I've got a rigged leg. Let me just grab the ankle controller and bring it up above the artwork, and now I can move this leg around and very quickly go from my character art that was designed in Illustrator to a rigged character here in After Effects. And I wanna show you something a little bit secret with this rig, which is if I turn on this cap tip, the cap itself is actually a hose and something that I can control just by moving around this base. We have all the bend controls in here, so I could change the roundness and the direction to modify the shape of the cap. I know I keep saying it, but all these new features open up so many more possibilities for what's possible with character rigging in After Effects. But one of my favorite parts about all of these possibilities is that it's all completely procedural, adjustable, and flexible after you've rigged it. So I can modify any of these properties however I want at any point in the process, even after I've animated these things, and it's not going to break my rig. Next up is RubberRig, which has been completely overhauled since version 2, and it's gonna be a perfect way to rig up this character that I drew in Photoshop. There's lots of textures and patterns applied to this that just wouldn't be easily recreated with shape layers, so it's a perfect example for RubberRig. I'm gonna focus on just the upper arm here, so I'll solo these 3 layers that belong to that section of the character rig, and the first step of the process is just to create a simple parent chain. So I'm gonna select the hand, parent it to the forearm, select the forearm, parent that to the upper arm, and now whenever the upper arm rotates, everything else is gonna move with it, and same thing down here. But the anchor points are not in the correct spots. I wanna move those to where the actual joints should rotate. So with the upper arm, I'm gonna switch to my pan behind tool or anchor point tool with Y on the keyboard and click and drag to right about the center of that shoulder. I'm not gonna be super precise with this. In general, you do want to be 100% precise and use perfectly circular joints if you wanna hide seams, but as you can see with this character art, it's kind of loose, it's rough. I'm not going for perfection with this character, so I'm not worried about this being 100% precise. I'll just move that anchor point about where I think it should be and rotate it to see how that shoulder joint moves on the top. Maybe I'll move it up a little bit. That looks pretty good. I'll move on to the forearm and do the same thing. To help find the center overlap of these 2 layers, I'm gonna switch over to my blend modes and change the upper arm since it's on top to something like difference. And actually, since my layers are so dark, that doesn't really work. Let's change it to divide, and there we go. Now we can see right where those 2 layers overlap. I'll grab my anchor point tool again with Y on the keyboard, click and drag this one to about the center of that joint, and then test the rotation to see how that behaves. I think that's gonna work pretty well. I'll turn off that blend mode and then do the same thing for the hand down here. I'll just move it to right about where I want the hand to rotate around. That should work. Now that my anchor points are set and my parent chain is created, all I have to do is select the last layer in the parent chain, in this case the hand, and click New RubberRig and give it a name. This is going to be the right arm, so I'll name it right arm. Shoulder wrist for the labels and click OK. Rubberhose is going to generate a bunch of layers, and just like that, I have a rigged arm with this custom artwork. Now, what in the world just happened? A few different things. First of all, it created these 2 bone layers and they're actually hidden. So let me unsolo all this. I'll turn on these bone layers and move them above the artwork. These are shape layers that are attached to this hose system. And actually, if we look at this layer right here, our arm, it's generated a hose underneath all of that artwork to act as the structure for the actual artwork layers to be parented to. And unlike parent to hose, this actually does use After Effects' native parenting system. So these two bone layers are going to stretch with the hose, and because these layers are now parented to those bones, they're going to stretch with it. So this is how you would rig something if you want the actual layers parented to the hose to stretch with it, unlike parent to hose, where those items do not stretch. Now these bones are going to be generated between controllers and points or bends along the hose, and they work with as many bends as you need. So if I had a parent chain longer than 3 layers, more bones will just be generated, and all of the artwork will be parented to the corresponding bones. And these really are just structural layers. You don't need to see them, which is why they're hidden by default. That the underlying structure is a hose and then bones attached to that hose. Now, one thing you will notice is if I grab the end controller and implement roundness, the hose itself is going to round out and the hand layer is going to orient to that roundness, but the bones themselves are not going to round out as well, and the artwork attached to those bones will not be distorted. And that's because this system of RubberRig is just using the transform controls like position, rotation, and scale to distort the layers and not actually create any mesh distortion or actual bending in that artwork. But just like everything else in Rubberhose 3, we have bend controls. So I could again modify the slide if I want it to be right at 50%. I could affect the hose length to make that stretch out a little bit more. And I can also freely change that bend direction. All right, I'm gonna turn that roundness back down to 0, and I wanna point out that the hand itself is not parented to anything. The last layer in the chain is going to be attached to the hose using parent to hose. So just like before, we have all those same controls, but it'll give us that ability to auto-rotate the layer or disable that if you don't want it. There is also another way, if you don't wanna use parent to hose for the end layer, to rig a limb with RubberRig. So let me do that really quickly with the leg down here. I'll just select those 3 layers, and again, move the anchor point. So I'll get this ankle where it should be roughly, move this one up here. Let's turn that blend mode on to just say like overlay so I can see that joint. And then grab the thigh and move the anchor point to about the center of that joint, and now create my parent chain. So shoe to calf, calf to thigh. I'll grab that shoe layer, the last one in the parent chain, and instead of just clicking new RubberRig with the tooltip here, I'm gonna shift click to exclude the end layer. I'll call this right leg, change the controller labels to hip and ankle, click OK, and now it's gonna generate those same bones and do the same parenting for those 2 artwork layers, but it's gonna leave the shoe detached, the last layer in the parent chain. It's just not going to use the parent to hose feature to attach it to the limb. What this allows you to do is to freely position this and use it maybe as the controller. So instead of using the ankle control to drive the limb, I could actually parent that to the shoe, and now the shoe layer is going to act as the driver for this leg. The downside to this is that we're not gonna get any of the auto rotation or other Rubberhose controls. This is just now a controller layer with no other features. But I wanted to show you that it is possible to do that without parent to hose. Personally, I love the parent to hose system, so I don't really see myself using that feature, but we wanted to include it just in case that's something you would want. One of the new sections in Rubberhose 3 is the power section, and this is a very interesting and extremely powerful new feature of Rubberhose. Specifically these first 2 buttons, Rig to EGP and EGP to Rig. EGP stands for Essential Graphics Panel. If you're not familiar with the Essential Graphics Panel, you should definitely look it up and start using it, because it basically allows you to add properties from within a comp that you can access outside of that comp. So if I nested this comp inside of another comp, I could have access to any of the supported properties with the Essential Graphics Panel. And we can take advantage of that with Rubberhose 3 with some really useful features. So what this does is takes any controls generated by Rubberhose and adds them to the Essential Graphics Panel. And I have a lot more layers here. I just shied them so we're not seeing them all, but with nothing selected, I'm gonna click Rig to EGP, and immediately every single supported Rubberhose property has been added to the Essential Graphics panel. Now, I could use these controls right here to modify what my character rig looks like. So why don't we just use the right leg hose length as an example? I could control that length right here in this panel rather than down here in my actual comp effect controls. But that's not what makes this feature powerful. Now that all of those controls have been added to this Essential Graphics panel, I can go into my project and find this comp, which is Turtle Rig, rig, and I'll pre-compose that into a new comp. In fact, let's change the resolution. I'm gonna put this at 1080 by 1080, and I'm gonna scale this down so it fits the comp a little bit better. And what I'm gonna do now is twirl open the contents of this layer and go into the new Essential Properties section, and every single one of those properties that we added over here in the Essential Graphics panel is now available within this layer's contents. So if I were to grab the left arm wrist position, I could lift it up from this comp, but this isn't a very easy way to control my rig, and that's where this next button comes into play. So let me undo this back to where it was, and I'm going to, with that layer selected, click the EGP to rig button, and right before our eyes, Rubberhose 3 is going to recreate all of the Rubberhose controllers for this rig, and it's going to allow me to freely pose this character nested inside of this comp. And it's all parented to the pre-comp, so it's all relative to that, meaning I can scale this down, I can rotate it, I can even flip it around so that it's facing the other direction, and all of my controllers are going to update and respond dynamically. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that there are a few controllers over here just floating. The reason for this is these belong to the shoulders and the hips. And the reason these are here is because back in our other comp, those 4 controllers, the shoulders and the hips, are parented to the torso. And that is one limitation of rig to EGP, is any layers that you want to be able to control inside of this comp in the actual positioning that they should be in cannot have parents. So that's why my ankle and wrist controllers, they're not parented to anything. This is just a limitation of this system, but it still provides a lot of flexibility because I can now make instances of this comp and even use the duplicate feature under the manage section. I can just duplicate this, and I'll call this duplicate turtle 2 and click OK, and that's going to duplicate this comp. I can now have 2 instances of the same character rig in the same nested comp with totally independent controls, allowing me to have a singular rig that I can then modify and use in several different ways within a single comp. So you could be instancing the same rig within a nested comp over and over to fill out the comp with multiples of the same character, or you could make several different comps using the same rig, doing different actions, maybe walking, running, sitting, looking at a phone, all from one rig that you've set up and reused multiple times. And this can be as simple or complex as you want it to be. By default, Rig to EGP is going to pull in all of the properties that it possibly can to the Essential Graphics panel. But let me undo back to before we did any of that. And let's say that I only want to bring in the controllers that I actually need access to, so the wrists and the ankles. I'll select just those controllers and click the Rig to EGP button, and then just the position and rotation values for those selected layers are going to be added to the Essential Graphics panel. If you wanted the other controls, like the hose bend and direction and all of that, all you would need to do is select the hose layer and click the Rig to EGP button. But I don't need all of those in my nested comp, so just to keep it simple and clean, I'm gonna undo that and just bring in the few properties I need to actually make this move. Now, if I were to bring this over right now, I'm gonna have some issues because the head layer has a parent of the torso, and I wanna be able to reposition that, or at least rotate the head. So in order to do that, I need to set up a few more controls. First of all, let's grab the torso layer and actually make a controller for it. So with it selected, I'll come over to void and click on the void button. That will generate a void right in the same spot, and I can use the offset controls to kind of just move it over here, and now that's going to be my torso controller. So I'm gonna just leave that name as torso void. And if you're not familiar with void, it's just a shape layer based alternative to null. So instead of using solids, it's a shape layer, and you can click the card above to learn all about void. It's actually really useful for character rigging, and we're gonna even look at it a little bit more in just a little bit. But I want to add another effect to this. So I'll come up to Effect, Expression Controls, and Angle Control, and I'll rename this Head Rotation. And then I'll grab the head's rotation, use my expression pick whip to grab that angle, and now I have an angle control on this void layer that's going to rotate the head. With that done, I can lock up that layer because I don't really want to move the head around in the position, just on that rotation value. So I'm gonna grab that effect control head rotation and click Rig to EGP. So now that's added to my controls here in the Essential Graphics panel. I'll call this head rotation. And then I'll grab the layer on its own and click Rig to EGP, and that's gonna bring in the torso's position and rotation as well. Now that all of that is set up, I'm gonna once again nest this in another comp. So let me go to my project and nest this inside of another comp. We'll call this turtle EGP, and again, I'll scale this down to 1080 by 1080, and also scale down the pre-comp so that it fits this comp a little bit better. Click the EGP to rig button, and it's gonna recreate all of those controllers that we added to the Essential Graphics panel. Now, one thing you will notice is that this torso void layer that I created, it's gonna be placed right in the center because it's not gonna bring that controller in with as much detail as we had in the other comp. So if I go to the effect controls, none of the void layer controls are there, but that's okay because I can just open up the anchor point and shift this over to have it be very similar to what we had in the other comp. But now I can click and drag to move that torso around, and I can even bring that head rotation back in. If I open up the essential properties here, these values can be linked with expressions in this comp as well. So I'm just once again gonna add an effect, expression controls, angle control, and call this head rotation, bring it up in my visibility here, and then just tie this essential property to that angle control. And now I'm able to rotate the head right on that same body controller, the torso controller that I have right here. And my character is ready to go, but I can push this even further because obviously there are 4 different Ninja Turtles and they all have different colors. So let's go back to our Turtle Rig comp, and I went ahead and added keyframes on all of the color values that use this orange color. So I'm going to make another expression control, and I'm gonna go ahead and just put it right on top of the torso void layer. So I'll just select that, come up to Effect, Expression Controls, Color Control, and I'll rename this Primary Color and sample this orange color. Now with all of these keyframes that I brought up, I just need to unlock these layers really quickly, and then I'll be able to tie each one of these colors to that expression control. So I'm gonna grab one of them with the expression pick whip, and now that that's applied, I can copy that color value to all of the others. So I'll just select my keyframes and paste, and now every single one of these is tied to my void layer. So if I grab that color control under the primary color, I can now change this to whatever I want, but I can also select that color property, click Rig to EGP, and that is now showing up in the Essential Graphics panel. I'll call this primary color and jump back to Turtle EGP. Now it lives right here. So what I can do is say duplicate this rig with the actual manage duplicate button. I'll duplicate it and we'll call this Turtle 2 and click OK. And now that entire rig has been duplicated. I can click and drag this to move it over. Let's fit both of them in the comp here. And on this second one, I'll open up those essential properties, grab this and maybe change it to a purple color. Now I have 2 of the Ninja Turtles using the exact same character rig. You can really push this pretty far too. I made this entire animation right here using the singular rig and just using expression controls to swap out the different attributes of each character. I even put in facial controls, all tied together using expression controllers and applied to that same torso void layer so that everything is nice and compact and accessible within this nested comp. I'm thinking about making an entire video dedicated to this rig and just showing you in a complete breakdown of how I set it up and how Rig to EGP really helps this process and how you can push it to make some really advanced rigs from a single comp. So if that sounds interesting to you, let me know down in the comments. So those are all the new major features of Rubberhose 3 that I wanted to cover in this video. There actually is more, but you can go watch all of the user guide videos that I made in the playlist and even on Battleaxe's website with the user guide to learn all the ins and outs of what this tool has to offer now. But I wanted to take a minute and talk about another tool we make. It's a freebie at Battleaxe called Void, which we've made some improvements to specifically for working with character rigs. So this character is all rigged up and ready to go, but it is not how I would leave it before animating because there's lots of layers here that I don't need to see that are gonna clutter up all of my timeline when I'm trying to add in keyframes and just focus on what I need to control it. So what I like to do is lock and shy all of those layers I don't need access to and enable the shy switch so I'm left with just the layers that control the character itself. So I can move the torso around, grab the controllers, rotate the head, do whatever I need to pose this character however I want. But I wanna take this a step further because if I bring up the position of all of these layers, all of the values are standard position values. I'm never going to be able to get back to this pose unless I set keyframes at these values and never touch them, unless I zero all of these values out. Now, this is not a new concept, but it is something that I asked Adam to implement into Void. It's one of the original requests I had for Void when Adam was making it. So the way that it works is just select any layer and click the Void button and it will generate a null layer. It's actually a shape layer, but it's essentially the same thing, just with no solids. But because I had a layer selected, it's going to generate that void right in the exact same place as that controller. And now you'll notice that the position is 0 on both the X and Y of the actual wrist controller, which means I could click and drag this, move it around, and now that it's not in that base standard pose, all I have to do to get back to it is set these values to 0, and there we go, we're back to normal. But that's actually not how I use void. I'm gonna delete that layer, select the controller again, and instead of just clicking on the void button, I'm going to Alt click on it, which will create and hide that void as well as shy it. It's completely invisible, but it's done the exact same thing of zeroing out those values. And if I disable my shy switch and look at the very bottom, there's my R-arm wrist void layer, and it's locked, it's shied, so I don't have to do any extra steps, and I've zeroed out that value. So I could do that for each one of these controllers. Alt click on void with each one of them selected, and it's going to zero out the transform controls for each one of them, even the cap tip. And this is what's really cool, is if a layer already had a parent, in the case of the head, for example, I'll alt click on void, that is going to maintain the parenting relationship. So moving the torso around is still going to move the head. It's gonna maintain that hierarchy so that your rig doesn't break. So all that's left here is the torso. I'll alt click on the void layer, and now the position values of all of these layers is 0, so I can always return to this pose no matter what I do. It's basically like a backup or freezing the transformations if you're used to that in Cinema 4D. It's one of my favorite features of void, so go check that out if you're not using it already. There's actually a lot more that you can do with void. In fact, let's jump over to my pixel rig and I'll show you how I am actually using void layers to drive puppet pins on the body. So let me just find the body layer. We'll solo that, and I'll unlock it and bring up the puppet tool. So you'll see that there are pins all along this layer, and I'll turn on my overlays so we can actually see them. Here are all the pins that are placed along this layer. I'm actually going to pick one of these. Let's say this one right here, which is the chin, and I'll Alt or Option plus Shift and equals to remove that expression. But now that there's no expression tying that to a void, all I have to do is, with it selected, again, click the void button, and it's going to automatically identify this is a puppet pin, and it's going to attach that puppet pin to the void layer. And from here, I can parent that to whatever I need it to. So since it was already set up, I'll just go ahead and undo back to before I had deleted that. But what this allows you to do is create much more complex relationships between your artwork and the controllers. So this controller right here is what's driving the head. If I rotate it, it's going to tip it up and down, but I've added in even more layers of control using rotation controls tied with expressions to those pins. Now that they're driven by nulls, I can use these rotations with expressions to modify those puppet pins' positions and parent them using native parenting controls to create a very flexible rig, and again really goes beyond what was capable with Rubberhose version 2 and allows you to create things that are much more complicated than just standard shape layers. All right, I'm gonna call it right there. I knew that this video was gonna be long because there are just so many new features with Rubberhose 3. I hope that you're excited about it and that you'll go check it out. Make sure that you go to the Battle Axe website and see what it's like. There's definitely gonna be a lot more Rubberhose 3 content coming from me here on this channel, so stay tuned for that, from character rigging, animation, setting up complex rigs using EGP, working with other character rigging tools, comparing other rigging tools to Rubberhose 3. So if you have any video ideas or topics that you want to see, definitely let me know down in the comments and I'll start making a list and knocking those out as quickly as I can. Also, if you use Rubberhose 3 in any way, shape, or form, please share your work on Instagram and anywhere else. Tag me at JakeInMotion and Adam at battleaxe.co. We would love to see and share your work. And if you have any feedback on any of our products, be sure to join the Battle Axe Discord. I'm in there, Adam's in there, we're both very responsive. We love to hear what you think about our tools and how you'd like to see them be developed in the future. If you have any ideas, that's where you can share them for future updates. So don't be shy, join that Discord and come say hey to me and Adam and everybody else in the community. And thank you for watching this video. Be sure to leave a comment down below about whatever feature you're most excited about. If you have any questions, I'm gonna be happy to answer those questions as quickly as I can. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.